Welcome to series 2 of Crime Tapes. Now, throughout this series, we're still in a situation where we're dealing with the pandemic, and as a result of that, we're having to record these podcasts in a slightly different way, including from home. So the sound quality might not be that we had in series 1. Please do bear with us a little bit on the quality of sound, which throughout the series of episodes you might find is impacted by the circumstances that we're dealing with. Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. This podcast is created in association with Staffordshire University and hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics and the Centre for Crime, Justice and Security. This, our second series, focuses on policing, and today I'm joined by Leanne Savage-Shaw, who's going to be talking to us about policing and policing legitimacy. Leanne is a lecturer in policing at the university, and her teaching largely focuses at and around the policing courses that we deliver here at Staffordshire. In this session, we're going to think about the police and what they do, but also the police's relationship with the public. And when we talk about those things, we often talk about and use the term police legitimacy. Now, that's a term that if you come and study criminology or social sciences, or you read newspaper stories, you might hear or encounter a lot, but it's one that perhaps we often don't unpack. So just to start off with, Leanne, welcome to the podcast. And can you tell us, what do we mean when we talk about this thing, police legitimacy?
Hello, James. Yes, thank you. I agree that actually it's quite a complex concept. We talk about it in different ways and probably mean slightly different things. But broadly, it is a sense that the police are doing the right thing and are supported by the public, that we support them in what they're doing. I suppose quite generally, it's that they're doing the right thing and we support that is what we can describe as police legitimacy.
That's a really good way of kind of describing how we think about the function of policing, because policing is a kind of controversial thing, isn't it? Although we sometimes don't think of it in that way. In the first instance, we kind of think of the police as law enforcers who will never really touch on our lives. But then at the same time, I'm also aware that, even as we talk, the kind of way that the police are represented in the media is sometimes as, as a kind of dangerous or a divisive force. Indeed, representations even go right the way through to, a sinister and corrupted organisation sometimes, line of duty style. But actually, for the majority of the public, a lot of the time, they just won't have contact with the police, will they? They're not an organisation that we come across very much.
Yeah, so if we're judging the police based on them having done the right thing or acting in the right ways, then we're making judgments about their work, even though a lot of the time we won't have that personal contact. So our perceptions of the police, the way that we think about the police very often does come through what we hear through other people, what we see on the media, what we see in TV and other areas, where actually it's not what we've done with the police and what the police have done with us. It's how they treat and manage other people, and also how that is then represented on things like the news and how we actually access that information, which probably isn't straightforward. It does give an even bigger complexity to it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting, it's a really interesting place to start out because as a criminologist, I kind of have an assumption that people know or understand the function of the police, but you teach people all the time about policing more broadly, and there's a lot that people just don't know, isn't there? There's a lot that's kind of and there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, at times about the role of the police and what they do. So for you, when you kind of first start to teach people policing, what is the function of the police in England and Wales? I mean, even that point, that I say England and Wales, people would not necessarily recognise the structure of the forces, the differences in forces, that, there's different control mechanisms, for example. And so when we talk about that, how would you kind of first introduce the police?
I suppose it starts with a bit of a story in history around kind of throwing it right back to the early 1800s, back to around 1829 when we saw the development of the first modern police force in London. And I suppose that's where a lot of all the ideas around what the police should do actually comes from. Way back then, back in the early 1800s, where we saw the development of what is now described as the Pelian principles, these ideas on which the police should operate and we should expect the police to operate. Things around that the public are the police and the police are the public, that they should police us according to what we think is appropriate, and their behaviour should be aligned to that, that they should behave in ways that is according to what the public would expect for them, and that their duties are in kind of tackling and reducing crime, but with the support of the police the whole way through, with the support of the public the whole way through.
And this is an interesting point, isn't it? Because I mean, if we go right the way back to the kind of establishment of first police forces in the UK, and as you say, the kind of Sir Robert Peel and policing the London kind of metropolis in the first instance, there was very different in some ways, because the police were not necessarily gratefully received by all, were they? There was a sort of scepticism from the British public, because policing was regarded as something that was continental and oppressive and not in the English character in a way, wasn't it? There was certainly some reluctance to accept a state police force.
Yeah, certainly. And I suppose part of these Pelian principles were about convincing the public that actually it's going to be a group of people who have the right morals at heart, and they're doing the right things for the right reasons. That actually we're going to give this group of people a set of instructions about how they should go about their behaviour and the type of things that they should do. Almost to kind of sell it to everybody involved that this is a good thing for the benefit of us, in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's different because in many ways, you know, the kind of view that often comes from people about the function of policing is that the foremost function of policing is essentially about kind of law enforcement or catching criminals. You know, that's the job that they do, prosecuting crime and catching criminals. But in many ways, that's not really the tradition of the police in England and Wales, is it?
Yeah, so it is very much really more so about making people feel safe, about the police performing the duties with the approval of the public, that this is something that the public do want, which really it's not about identifying and imprisoning offenders, but actually about making a community feel safe, that they're around people who are doing the right thing. If we have legislation in place that people are abiding by that legislation, and we kind of expect that anyway, but actually the police are there as an additional measure to make us feel safe, and support us as a public or a community, that you know, we've got that group there to guide us and to guide other people.
And to prevent crime as well as kind of prosecute it. And it's kind of led to a viewpoint in many ways that the British model of policing, and I'm moving from kind of England and Wales here, but the British model of policing and what's talked about as kind of policing by consent is different to that of much of the rest of the world, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about what do academics mean when they talk about policing by consent?
Yeah, so I suppose the idea that actually it is what the public want, that we will consent to being policed because the police are effectively legitimate, that they are doing the right thing, that they are behaving as we would expect them to, that they are ethical, that the legislation is what it should be.
And that they're not corrupt like on Line of Duty, which I think is interesting because, you know, I think those sorts of representations as well, at the same time as we have, on one hand, we have the kind of British police as often held up as this model of best force in the world. We started off by talking about the kind of mediatised image of policing. And often we hear about the police in many ways, don't we, when things go wrong in policing. And the police, for much of their kind of, they're not really identified with their everyday sort of successful activities of low-level order maintenance and dealing with the kind of everyday crimes. But the police hit the press and the news when they do something bad that people don't like, and that kind of taints understandings of them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've kind of pointed out the English and Wales and the British model of policing, but actually what we tend to see in the media is things about police work and police treatment of people in other countries as well. And actually that can still impact upon our ideas of how legitimate the police are, you and I here, regardless of where we see that.
Absolutely. And that takes me to a fascinating one, because recently one of the things that's kind of defined the debates on police powers and police treatment, for example, was the death of George Floyd in the States in America, which I think one of the most interesting things about that was how it kind of culturally crossed a context into, for example, being reported on in the United Kingdom, which has got a very, very different tradition and is very different in some ways. And yet there was I noticed quite commonly a failure to differentiate between, for example, the United States, as if all was universal in a way, and that seems to be happening more and more. But I say that I suppose I ought to go back, and I'm talking about at the kind of outset of some of the protests about about Black Lives Matter and the kind of movement of that agenda, although they'd started historically further back. The death of George Floyd at the hands of Officer Derek Chauvin and colleagues certainly did seem to be something that really did bring into question wider debates about police legitimacy beyond their original context. Could you just tell us a little bit, because I'm sure some readers won't necessarily know the full kind of details. What happened with the George Floyd case?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important one for a lot of reasons. Namely, one, the officer that was actually kind of dealing with this situation where George Floyd was being arrested for using counterfeit money, ultimately, but he was arrested by a white officer who knelt on his neck for 9 minutes-ish, approximately 8 to 9 minutes, whilst he was handcuffed and lying face down to the ground. And
so
I think
he was largely subdued, wasn't he? And I mean, anyone that's seen the footage or even just the still images from it, I think, especially, I've encountered many people in the police and the prison service in the United Kingdom more broadly, who are absolutely aghast at those images and the use of force, because it would just never be considered legitimate here at the moment. But it certainly did highlight a problem in policing, particularly in the States initially, didn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reasons that it struck a chord here in the UK were for many of the same reasons that it did in the US, with this idea of disproportionality, as we describe it in policing, that actually young black men in particular, black communities are policed more heavily. They experience a greater level of stop and search, those kinds of practices. They experience generally disproportionately in relation to other populations, a greater amount of use of force, such as was seen with George Floyd. So that creates all of this discussion, all of this debate, and brings all that to the fore.
And disproportionately in the United States of America and in the United Kingdom as well, are criminalised, incarcerated and failed in the justice system at a level that, isn't just kind of explainable, it would seem, on grounds of economics or sort of, there's an awful lot going on. But in the case of George Floyd, I think there's perhaps something interesting about how also images now and what we see of the police is such an important thing, because I guess, for many of the kind of historic moments of the police and their kind of conduct, whether in the United States of America or in the United Kingdom, we simply wouldn't see malpractice. But that seems to have changed really perhaps in the 1990s with the kind of Rodney King case, doesn't it? And I think perhaps would you feel that now the police operate under perhaps a greater degree of kind of scrutiny and oversight than they have historically?
Yes, definitely. I think, with the advent of technology, we get to see more of what the police are doing. We see it more in the media, in social media. We see, like you say, those images, video footages that we wouldn't have seen before. They're very often wearing body-worn cameras. And actually, in an attempt to be transparent, in an attempt to show us as a public that we should trust the police, that they are legitimate, we get to see footage like that that's even shared through police forces themselves. And actually they're willing to show us what they're doing and where they've gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, even the footage that you can be shown on social media, for example, that's been taken from people filming encounters on the street, for example, can be edited and cut short so that, seeing is not always believing at times. I'm not suggesting that about the case of George Floyd at all or others, but in the case of Rodney King and George Floyd, we very definitely did see the sort of full events play out. But there are other times where, for example, police officers it can seem like they've behaved in a way that's wholly disproportionate, but you haven't seen the background to events. And I saw recently the Metropolitan Police, for example, a superintendent in the Metropolitan Police now making Twitter videos explaining to the public, for example, why it is that several officers are involved in a use of force, why it is that they take someone to the ground, why it is that someone seems to be holding the head of the person involved. And those things that can initially appear shocking to people can be, they can be exploited and taken out of context as well, can't they?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that probably could take us back to the case of Mark Duggan back in 2011, where we perhaps didn't get much of that clear context that Mark Duggan was shot by the police as a black male. And the news stories that came from that were actually misconstrued, and they weren't actually genuine representations of what had happened in that moment. And they led to real complexities and debates and actually riots around, what actually happened in that moment, the police treatment of Mark Duggan and his family and everything that followed that incident. So actually being able to see these kinds of things has it's like a double-edged sword.
Absolutely. Well, the Duggan case is a fascinating one, and perhaps one we should talk about, because as you say, it kind of led to riots and then copycat riots in London and then spread out to many other cities in the United Kingdom, and we saw kind of the worst riots that we've seen in several cities, including my own Birmingham and London and areas of Nottingham, for example. Copycat incidents kind of play out in several different places. And the starting point for all of that, as you say, was a hot stop, and then Mark Duggan being shot by a police officer. But what specifically happened in that case, do you think, that kind of led to that questioning of police legitimacy? And why do you think it was that in that case that we saw that kind of public reaction to it?
Again, I think a lot of this comes down to some of the historical relationships, some of what we know about policing before that interaction. So there were already fraught relationships between the police and the public in that community where Mark was shot. And so we're already, if we've got low levels of legitimacy or perceptions of the police that are negative, when something big like this happens, actually that can be just something that ignites that fire. That reminds us of actually how illegitimate or unfair the police are in these situations. It can be the thing that leads us to unite as a group. For example,
some criminologists talk about flashpoint moments, don't they, in public disorder, and therefore it's not. While it's tempting to see, for example, the incident as being the whole of the incident, it is really that is just either the straw that broke the camel's back, or it's the trigger for something much wider in terms of there's already that degree of public dissatisfaction. And I suppose, Mark was drawn from an estate in London that had notoriously long tensions with the police, and particularly the police in those areas often have a reputation for kind of brutality or, underhandedness or heavy-handedness that, we as criminologists know and hear about, and vice versa. Some of the police would kind of suggest that their reputation sometimes is overstated, and that's not necessarily the case, and they just get a kind of bad rap. But in terms of that feeling towards the police, like I say, I suspect that many people often don't think about the way that, you know, they might hold perceptions about the police and how they would interact with them when they come into contact with them. And that's where I think some of your research is really, really fascinating as well, though, because I often find that, you know, even the most kind of law-abiding and reasonable people can hold some very strange attitudes towards the police when you move them onto the topic of road policing, which is what you research, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. So part of the concept of legitimacy is around this idea of fairness and how fair the police are, whether that's in those interactions themselves or based upon where they're policing and how frequently they police an area or a road. So a lot of my research has focused on kind of fairness in policing, both in the context of, for example, response or neighbourhood policing, but also in the roads context, where it is a bit of a contentious issue that we want the roads to be policed. We want other bad people to be targeted. We want them off the roads, but not us. I'm a good driver and I do it well. You don't need to police me.
Well, this is the interesting thing, and I suppose this is where I was getting at with your research, because I suspect that for a great many people, you know, who would have very, very little interaction with the police in any other context, the one place that they might, and the one that might shape their view of the police, is whether they get pulled over by them while driving. And it does strike me that there is a kind of particularly a kind of British approach to any sort of perceived infraction on us when we're using the roads. How dare they fine me for speeding? Everybody does it, you know, but how dare they come after me, or how dare they put more speed cameras or up on my patch of road, you know, is often something that I do encounter, and I rarely encounter people who think themselves a bad driver, for example, although, you know, so it's an interesting one. But like I say, it's a place where people may, for example, come into contact with the police. So, for example, using your mobile phone while you're driving. I know there are some people who would never entertain doing that, but I suspect from what I see out and about, there are a lot more people that just through force of habit now, for example, will pick it up and in doing so commit an offence, for example. So in your research on police legitimacy and road, what kind of things do you find in terms of how that shapes public views?
Yeah, so the roads historically is the place where the public are most likely to have that interaction with the police that they haven't initiated, that they don't particularly want, that leads to an outcome that they don't particularly want. So it is one of these areas where we do develop our notion of legitimate or not policing because of how we are policed on the roads. And also what we find in terms of roads behaviour is that drivers do overestimate their own skill, their own ability, and kind of don't see the need or the purpose for the police to be targeting them because, you know, my skill is way up here. I'm really good at what I do. So actually that does lead to some the development of a notion of legitimacy. How fair is it that the police are policing me in doing this when I do it well? Or part of it is about the less obvious consequences, that you might speed or you might use your phone, but nothing bad happens. So actually the police aren't needed here because there's so many other crimes that happen where we do need the police, that they should be out there tackling that crime.
That's a fascinating one, isn't it? Because I do remember, and it goes right the way back to things like some of the comments when a police officer was shot by Raoul Moat. Raoul Moat indeed himself used the justification, you know, that if they were catching proper criminals, not picking on ladies who were driving their kids, you know, which is a kind of it's a classic offender justification, you know, that what the police do is they pick the low-hanging fruit and they pick on the motorist. And I suspect that even though, you know, we'd hold Raoul Moat out there as, you know, having values not very like the rest of us, in that little glimpse, I think we saw something of a kind of an attitude or a sentiment that perhaps far more people have expressed at times than necessarily they'd admit to afterwards. But then I suppose even if the police are policing the roads, there are ways that they can do that more or less legitimately. So from your research, what kind of things, when the police do have encounters with the public, what matters in shaping those interactions? What is it that's important that they do?
Okay, so in a particular interaction, so when somebody has been stopped, for example, we see that things like trust are important. So believing that the police officer is acting in a trustworthy way, that we can trust them, in them allowing us to have a say in what's happened, in them hearing our voice and just listening to our viewpoint helps as well. Them treating us in an unbiased way also helps. So giving me the same kind of treatment that I would expect you to give anybody else in this situation. And just generally treating us with respect in the way that they communicate with us. So actually just talking to us as a human being, as I would expect to be treated. So all of those things really matter during that interaction. Anything that happens outside is important as well. So you always police this road, but you wouldn't police that road over there. So actually, how fair is that? So things about how the resources are allocated with the police as well. Where problems are seen to be, are they being tackled effectively? That's also judged by the police by the public in their idea of what is legitimate. So it's what goes on in that interaction, but also what leads to that interaction that's important as well.
Absolutely, and I suppose that kind of explains the thing of, the classic thing of if you do get stopped by the police driving, it is that kind of thing of you could be catching real criminals like burglars, not me. It does tend to be, as you say, sort of part of the framing, ignoring the fact that actually you're probably not best catching burglars through road policing, in the rush hour in normal times of day, But like you said, it's that kind of there's a framing and an expectation, isn't there? Sometimes around just those interactions and how things are explained and how they're perceived to be legitimate. So, for example, and that also gives rise to other questions about the police conduct. Even as we talk today, I think, at times I do tend to feel with the police that they're kind of, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And I think a lot of police officers would kind of echo that sentiment. If they stand back and don't act, they're condemned. If they jump in and rush to act, they're condemned. And they can feel like they're kind of fighting an ever-losing battle, I think, at times. And that we certainly do know that kind of comes out in police occupational culture. I think when you start to look at the occupational culture, it's very common to find the police feeling, at times that the public are not necessarily like them. But that in some ways is a bit of a dangerous path, isn't it? If the police do start to kind of feel that they are different, and I know, for example, that's one of the concerns that some people have expressed about the adoption of things like thin blue line badges that are worn by police officers now. That that kind of feeling that there is a differentiation between them and the public might be problematic. Would you share that concern?
Yeah, so I've spoken to lots of officers about this idea that we are the police and we support each other, and they have their kind of that group identity, not only as the police, but even smaller than that. So within teams that they work with, they have kind of a shared identity that this is us and we've got each other's backs, and that separates them from the public. And the public aren't even just one public. We've got victims, we've got offenders, and we see them in different ways as well.
Absolutely,
Actually, that there's so many different groups of us and them that it's just so diverse.
Uniform police CID, for example,
Yeah. So it's. I don't think it's as simple as kind of having the police and the public. Actually, when you get to speak to the police, as I've been able to do, they talk about it in really, intense ways that the public are different types of people depending on what public you're talking to.
Yes.
They can be walking down a street and speak to someone who's very supportive of the work that they're doing, who will wish them a good day, and walk down that same street a little bit further and someone will, throw expletives at them and they can get the exact opposite treatment. That actually it's very at an individual level, but also there are kind of some group and shared kind of identity aspects going on here that does influence how the police interact with the public, and consequently it influences how the public interact with the police and how the public see the police as legitimate or not.
Absolutely, and just to kind of pursue that a little bit, because the topics that I think are interesting, and I'm interested in your views on, because and I do realise that different people may hold different opinions, and I think one of the things that we really ought to say more is different opinions are great, and we kind of we should welcome discussion and variance of viewpoints. But I'm minded that even as we have these conversations, I think back, for example, to in Bristol with the Black Lives Matter protest and the removal of the statue of Edward Coulson. The statue gets pulled down and tossed into the harbour, for example. And the police at the time in Bristol, Avon and Somerset Constabulary, took the very active decision in that instance not to kind of intervene and not to arrest people. Now, that I suppose was always going to be a kind of divisive issue, because on one hand there will be people who say, even if you can have sympathy with the sentiment that they're expressing, they're not taking down the statue legitimately, and it's the police's role to kind of enforce order, and they should get involved and arrest people. The other side of thought, of course, is that actually those arrests could escalate the situation, that the police could understand the sentiment that was behind the protests, and in that instance, perhaps a better course of action is to essentially let events play out, as it were, and not to get involved, because to get involved could seem in and of itself a political act. When you come across something like that, how would you kind of view that?
I think I'm on the kind of perspective that actually the police made the right decisions in that situation, that actually that things could have escalated if they had attempted to intervene, that these people were trying to show what they're about, what is important to them, what matters to them. And yes, part of that could have involved police intervention. It could have involved arrests. That the police had powers to do that. But actually, if the police had intervened in that situation, the police could have put themselves in a situation where they were seen as illegitimate rather than what the statue stood for. And it, because of the broader context of it, it's what that statue stands for, what those people tearing down that statue are doing that for. It's the purpose and the background and the historical context that are all relevant. It's not just that an offence is being committed and an arrest should be made. And that's why the police have discretion to make decisions, because all of these things are important to take into consideration when the police are interacting with the public.
And that's one thing that people don't necessarily get about the police, isn't it? That their powers, in many ways, are discretionary, and that indeed, for example, because similarly, the other thing, and what I was going to move to talk to you about in terms of police legitimacy, because I think it's probably the other thing that's had more of an impact than anything else, is the recent last year, the COVID pandemic, where increasingly the police have been called on and placed in a position, I personally think a very unenviable position in some ways, of being kind of given the role of policing the pandemic, given the power to fine and so on. Now, of course, one thing that we ought to also acknowledge is that there's long-standing recognition that the police in many ways shouldn't be subject to any political inference from on high. So the politicians shouldn't be telling police officers how to use their powers. But the pandemic has kind of created that. And of course, at times, that non-intervention can become something of a complex issue. And this brings me on to Rhodes, Bernard Castle and an eye test, which is a kind of classic example of policing, where Dominic Cummings, at the time Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor, had COVID and drove up to Durham, but actually it was on his wife's birthday that he took his second drive to Bernard Castle. He says to test his eyes. Now he was actually stopped, I believe, by the police on the way up to Durham, but they didn't fine him or penalise him. Do you think they were right not to in that instance?
I think they probably treated him in any way that they would treat anybody else. And given what we've already said about legitimacy being about fairness, about treating people without bias, that actually we shouldn't treat that person in any way that we wouldn't treat anybody else. So actually those decisions were probably led by the idea that the police are enforcing this at a last resort, that actually it's better to be able to engage and
explain absolutely. And if he's there and says, well, actually I'm in a situation where I have to take my child up to be able to have childcare, and this is about, we've got to remember, I suppose this played out in the very early days of the pandemic as well. But it's interesting, isn't it? And I mentioned that one, and I really have put you on the spot in this podcast in a way that I haven't for others. And I did feel for you, because you're kind of having to answer those questions about what you think. But it's interesting, because I think that was a turning point in some ways in the policing of the pandemic, which became kind of characterised then as a bit of a symbol of them and us. It was almost as if the police had done Dom the favour because he's establishment, but they wouldn't treat the rest of us like that. We'd have all got ticketed. And I think it is a great incident in some ways in showing the complexity that they can operate within, and how just what might seem for an individual officer a small and kind of innocuous decision in many days in an everyday shift can blow up to become a huge story. I mean, similarly, I remember, and everyone seems to have forgotten it now, but Plebgate involving the police as well. With for those that don't know, that was Andrew Mitchell MP, where he was accused of abusing police officers, which then kind of leaked into the press and became a much bigger issue, perhaps than the words uttered at the time. But I think it's a really interesting topic. As a final question, just because it's one I don't really know. Does it tend to be that people tend to have at the outset fairly static or fixed ideas about the police from where they start from in terms of their positioning? Do you tend to find that there are people who are just more generally supportive and others who are just more generally kind of anti or concerned or questioning of a police role? Or is it the case that people's attitudes towards the police and their legitimacy kind of shift and are a bit more fluid?
I think that's a really good question. And probably one thing that's really important to mention is that we, in the UK, in England and Wales, we have high levels of support for the police. We have high levels of perceived police legitimacy. We do think that the police are doing a good job generally around us. And actually, whilst that might be consistent, that actually over the years we do see that generally we like the police and what they're doing. We think they're doing a good job. Actually, there are moments that can change that our idea of legitimacy does change. It isn't fixed. And bringing it back to the coronavirus legislation and the impact that has, well, an introduction of a new law puts the police in a difficult position of having to police something that's introduced the day before, that they really don't understand the complexities of fully yet, and yet they're expected to go out there and police it. And it's just one of the many reasons that I think I'm lucky to teach policing rather than do policing. But actually, that the introduction of the coronavirus legislation that interferes with some of the everyday things that we've always done, that we've never been told to stay in our homes and only go out for essential shopping before. And all of a sudden, the police have new powers where they're allowed to make you do that. And all of a sudden, it becomes important that they're enforcing these new laws in a fair way or a way that's seen to be appropriate. Otherwise, we're judging them on how they're kind of conceiving of that legislation, of how they're implementing that and what they're doing with it. I completely forgot your question, James. I'm so
No,
sorry.
it's not. No, I was wondering about people's kind of starting point in terms of their viewpoint of the police. Because one of the things, and I think you hit on it, and it actually surprised me when you go and start looking at things. But it's quite interesting where distrust and trust, for example, of the justice system fits. And so, for example, I saw some YouGov polling, for example, that suggested that people who voted Leave in the EU referendum were far more distrusting of the justice system than people who voted Remain. With that last point, I don't know where I'd go from that, but I just thought it was quite interesting because my expectation was probably the reverse of that. That Leave voters would have quite high confidence in the justice system because you tend to think of it as being quite a sort of traditionalist and older movement which I would expect to more kind of strongly correlate with a kind of confidence in the state and the justice system. But actually what also comes out of that kind of YouGov polling and so on is that people in the United Kingdom have a much greater confidence in the police and the justice system than even someone like me as a criminologist often think. We tend to kind of take the exception as the norm, as it were, and at times where you see signs with all coppers are bastards and protests and so on, you can kind of think of confidence in policing being very, very low, but actually for the most part most people tend to have a fair amount of confidence, don't they? I just wonder to what extent that kind of pre-exists, and I also wonder to what extent negative perception of the police is individual and personal in terms of experience, and to what extent it's mediated. Because going back to that kind of earlier comment, I think the one thing that does strike me is that that oftentimes recently I haven't seen very many positive portrayals of policing in the media, but those kind of positive portrayals and the good stories are also quite important, one would expect, in shaping public legitimacy, because a lot of what the police actually do is not really fighting crime, but it's being in communities and trying to, as you say, kind of build their confidence, isn't it?
I think that brings us back full circle, really, doesn't it, to what were the police there initially to do? What were the principles that our modern police force was built upon? And it is that idea of there to support the police, to support the public. And actually, we're operating in conjunction with each other about ideas that we see as mutually important. Yes, and that has a large part to play in it, I think, that actually we do have these high levels of perceived legitimacy because of the way that the police force originates, because of the way that it operates, because of the way that we're brought up to appreciate that the police are applying these rules and these laws in a certain way.
And a lot of the time, and it does bring me to the point that a lot of the time, the police aren't really applying or dealing with laws at all. It seems to me that increasingly in a kind of 24-hour society, that the police just have become a sort of missionary problem solver for anything that occurs outside of normal hours. And certainly when I talk to police officers, what I often experience now is they spend far more time dealing with people, for example, in acute mental health crisis, who are on the cusp of suicide, children who've run away from home, people who are finding it difficult to kind of just deal with life, as it were, and actually they seem to and this is borne out in some of the literature as well on policing, that actually they've moved from being in many ways a kind of law enforcement body to one that a lot of the time seems to be doing a kind of community social work, as it were. Is that something that comes out in your work, Leanne?
Yes, definitely. Speaking to a lot of police officers, they talk about kind of the multidimensional nature of their role, that they are a social worker, that they are that they're much more than a police officer, that they're a mental health worker, that they're responding to reports of missing people, that actually is a much bigger job than it's being simply about crime and criminality. And actually, it's not just us that makes judgments about police legitimacy, that there are reports that talk about police legitimacy, and one of the ways that it's measured really is through the effectiveness of policing. And one of the issues that those reports have highlighted is that actually the police are expected to do more now with fewer resources now, that actually that's really stretching them, that it's putting pressure on police forces. And police forces are kind of measured on their effectiveness with, we see one force as outstanding, one is inadequate, and everyone else kind of sits in the middle. But actually the things that are hindering them, that are leading to inadequacies, are the police being so stretched that they're having to deal with so many more things outside of traditional policing that we might see, and deal with all of these other things that are going on within the community, in building those relationships, in responding to issues around mental health or other types of health. Because what do you know? We know the number for the police, even if we can't get into contact with the mental health services or other social services that we need access to.
Absolutely, they don't close down at 5:30 on a Friday night, and I certainly get that from serving officers. It's really interesting, and I mean, I used to similarly say it with the prison service. They're the one organisation that when people contact them, they just can't say no, much like the prison service can't refuse those sent to them by the courts, even if they'd quite like to sometimes, and the police are in a kind of similar position, and it seems that is creating some of the kind of difficulties. And I think a lot of that work simply isn't shown nowadays, and we don't see it. But for anyone who's looking for an interesting career or something interesting to do, that makes a nice creation, because obviously at Staffordshire University, alongside the new police apprenticeships or police constable degree apprenticeships for the Midlands forces, West Midlands, Staffordshire, West Mercia and Warwickshire, we're running pre-joined degrees in policing alongside a degree for those who would like to be police detectives as well now. I understand you're teaching on some of them, Leanne, and it suggests to me that it would be an ever interesting and varied career. So if you are interested in the police as a career, it may well be worth checking out our website and having a look at Staffordshire University. All that leaves me to do is to say thank you, Leanne. It's absolutely fascinating and really, really interesting. And I do apologise in that I've put you on the spot on your thoughts around policing and what they should be doing, perhaps far more than I have others. But I think it's really, really interesting and kind of stimulating, and I'm sure that people listening, it will get them thinking, talking and engaging. So thank you ever so much for giving up your time today. So that's all for me this week. But if you are interested in our courses, do check out our university website at Staffordshire University, and do have a listen to some of our other podcasts that are available on Buzzsprout.